All right, so in this video, we're going to review the important inventions and contributions from medieval Europe, the Middle East, and China. And we're reviewing these because quite a few of these inventions helped lead to advancements in the Renaissance and quite a few units that we'll be covering this semester. So we'll start off with medieval Europe. Now, if you remember from eighth grade, there wasn't a whole lot going on in medieval Europe. In terms of inventions and contributions, but there were some key ones, including the architecture. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see castles and cathedrals. Medieval Europeans built strong castles. They're actually inspired from what they saw on crusades. And these castles had a lot of defenses, like you can see in the picture, the moats, the tall walls and towers that were also very thick. There's going to be a gatehouse with a murder hole. Even the stairwells were designed to benefit swordsmen, right-handed swordsmen defending the castle. On the bottom right corner, you'll see cathedrals. These are considered an accomplishment because most buildings in Europe around the Middle Ages were about 1 to 2 stories made out of wood. But these cathedrals often took over 100 years to build, made out of stone, and cost a lot of money. So they're considered works of art and a very impressive accomplishment. And on the left side of the screen, you can see Magna Carta, or the signing of Magna Carta. The man signing it is King John. And he was such a bad king in England that his lords and bishops kidnapped him and forced him to sign this document that took away some of his power and gave more power to the people. So this was in 1215, and we start seeing this idea that people have rights and leaders should not have unlimited power. And that's kind of about it for Europe. And now we start our slides on the medieval Middle East. And at this time, Islam had been founded as a religion, and the Islamic Empire had spread throughout the Middle East. And Muslims were really curious about the world around them and tended to study a lot of things. So what you can see on this page on the left side, we have zoology. So Muslims studied animals, and this is actually from a page from someone's travels where they saw what is obviously a giraffe and wrote down information. So you almost see kind of guidebooks coming out of medieval Middle East as well. But they studied zoology, they studied animals, they learned to make medicine from animals, like using cat intestines in surgeries. They were also very advanced in navigational tools. So on the top right, you see a compass and an astrolabe, which are very important tools if you want to navigate, especially if you are in a boat. And this is going to come up several times this semester, but the Muslims perfected the compass and the astrolabe. And then on the bottom right screen, we're going to talk about math for a little bit. We just reviewed the ancient Roman numerals. So if you've seen Super Bowl advertisements, those are Roman numerals. The Muslims put forth Arabic numerals, so what you use in math class. So you can see in the bottom right screen, the numbers that you're very familiar with were made popular in the Middle East in the Middle Ages. Continuing with the math theme in the medieval Middle East in the top right corner, Muslims also made the concept of zero popular. So when people were doing math problems, and if you subtract 1 from 1, the answer is 0. But Muslims made popular the idea of actually like having a number for that. So the symbol of 0. And in the bottom right of the screen, if you are in algebra or will be taking algebra, the Muslims invented algebra. And depending on how much you like math, this may or may not be a good thing. But what this allowed Muslims to do is they were able to figure out the circumference of the earth to within 9 miles. So, I don't even know where to begin to do that. I'm not really great at math, but they were able to figure out how many miles go around the earth. So they also knew that the earth was round. And then on the left-hand side, you can see several astronomers. Muslims studied the stars and the planets and the moon, and were able to make a lot of strides in that department. And then on our last slide of the medieval Middle East, they made popular the game of polo, which was a sport played by wealthy people in the Middle East. And then on the right-hand side, something else that the Muslims were very excellent at was medicine. And this is kind of a contrast that we see in the Middle East, in medieval Europe. In Europe, people tended to... they didn't really have doctors, especially in the smaller towns, so the barber would also double as the doctor. So the guy who cut people's hair and beards and toenails would also then perform medical examinations. And usually in medieval Europe, that meant bloodletting. So if someone had a fever or was sick or had a cough, they would just bloodlet. So either cut a cut on the upper arm or put leeches on to get rid of the, quote, bad blood. In the Middle East, and we'll see later in China, things were a little bit different. So again, Muslims were curious about the world around them. They figured things out with reason and logic. And one of the things that they created were hospitals. So they actually had hospitals kind of like what you see today, where there are separate wards for different illnesses. So, you don't have someone who has a fever in one bed and is recovering from surgery in another. They actually had separate wards for different illnesses. Their hospitals cater to anyone, even if you couldn't afford something. And then in the bottom right corner, Muslims also had very successful surgeries and medicine. So they had hundreds of medicines. They were able to perform many surgeries like removing tumors, cutting off limbs, and then my favorite, cataract eye surgery. So they could actually remove cataracts from people's eyes and they wouldn't die, which is something that medieval Europe still had not figured out. And then moving on to the medieval Chinese. So we'll start with sort of transportation. On the top right corner, let's see if I click it. You can see a little GIF of canal locks. So the Chinese were able to, there are lots of rivers in China. They used canals to get around. So these canal locks allowed boats to go sort of up and down. And you can see the GIF. This is actually a GIF of the Panama Canal, but it allowed boats to move different heights over mountains. Maybe not mountains, but again, you can kind of see this engineering feat that the medieval Chinese were able to accomplish. And then on the bottom right of the screen, you can see segmented bridges. So the Romans had pretty impressive bridges, and the Chinese also had impressive bridges as well. These are a little bit different. You can see that there are segments within the bridge, like smaller arches, and that allowed the bridge to be longer and wider than usual. So you can actually see a lot of segmented bridges today. A lot of times highways or railroad bridges will have sort of segments in them, and that's a medieval Chinese contribution. And what it allowed for in medieval China is in cities, they would have bridges over canals, and these bridges would be so wide that they could have shops, like tiny little stalls all up and down the sides of them, and still allow for people and carts to walk down the middle. And then on the left, the ocean-going ships. So these were known as junks, and these were like massive, massive ships, almost the size of a football stadium. I like to think of them as like a large cruise. And they were called junks or dragon ships, and they could be at sea for over a year without having to resupply, and they had like fresh gardens and fresh food and fresh water. And you can see a small ship for comparison. That's actually the proportion, or the sizes work out that it's the small ship is what Christopher Columbus set sail in about 50 years after the Chinese burned their entire fleet of junks, which we'll talk about later. Another medieval Chinese invention is movable type. So the Chinese carved out little square blocks and put their characters or letters on every single block so they could print faster instead of writing everything by hand. And we'll actually talk about a guy named Johann Gutenberg who invents the movable type in Europe, but he uses metal. But again, it helps the Chinese print faster, which leads us to the picture on the top right, paper making. So the Chinese invent paper making. which allows them to do things like print paper currency, print decks of cards for games, be able to carry more money because it's a lot lighter, so on and so forth. In the bottom right corner, the Chinese also invent tea. So if you're a big fan of tea, or if you're aware of a lot of major historical events like the Boston Tea Party, in the 1700s, Europeans went nuts for tea, leading to things like the American Revolution. In the bottom left corner, you can see a man making a steel sword. The Chinese invented steel, and it's a stronger material that is very flexible. So it's used in a lot of building projects because you can bend it and manipulate it, but it is very, very strong. And finally, our last slide for the medieval Chinese. We'll start with the left. Just like the Muslims, the Chinese had a lot of progress with medicine and taking care of illnesses. So in the picture, you see a doctor taking the pulse of one of his patients. But the Chinese also successfully made a smallpox vaccine, as well as they figured out how to disinfect a room. So they would release sort of a chemical in the air and it would disinfect a room. And this is at a time, again, where medieval Europeans had no idea what germs were or why they spread illnesses. The bottom right corner, you can see a pile of gunpowder. This was actually an accidental discovery. Chinese scientists were trying to figure out a way to immortality, and they accidentally made gunpowder, which is highly explosive if it's in a container. So if you just have a pile of gunpowder sitting out and light it on fire, it releases gas but doesn't actually explode. But if you put it in a container with a little opening, it will, if you put it in a container and seal it, it'll explode. But if you look in the top right corner, you see a man lighting a rocket, which uses gunpowder. It has a small opening on the end where the gas can escape and the rocket flies into the air. Now, this seems like very basic, but our rockets today kind of use a similar technology to work. And that is it for right now.